Hello and welcome to Principles of Zoology Online. Let's get started with some announcements. First of all, check out the revised syllabus. I posted that on Canvas and you'll be able to see all the updated due dates and chapters that we're going to be covering. I will be posting recordings of my lectures on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, so around the time when we normally have class. The SmartBook assignments are still due and I've corrected those dates. Typically it'll be a Tuesday or Thursday as usual. If we do any in-class activities, you'll be able to submit those online through Canvas. Mini exams are going to be open during the same time frame as normal, Thursdays through Mondays. And the only difference is that you will have a limited time frame. So you can take it on KaiTester at any computer. However, if you wanted to look up every single answer in the book, you wouldn't have enough time. Now, I don't expect you all to be saints, so I'm fine if you want to look in the book. But what I would suggest is to find a quiet place so you won't be interrupted, and then answer the easy problems first. And then if you want to look up harder questions in the book, you can see how much time you have to do that. So again, you have any time between Thursday and Monday to take the mini exam. However, once you start, you have a limited time to do it. And the way I'll determine the amount of time for the mini exam is I have recordings of the lengths of time it took previous students to do these mini exams, and then I'll add some extra time onto that. So you won't run out of time, but you won't have enough time to look up every single answer in the book. And feel free to ask me, email me with any questions that you have. So for labs, the first draft of your entire paper is due today. You can submit that on Canvas. And then you'll be doing a peer review of each other's work. And I'll send out a separate announcement with details to follow. And then the final draft of your lab paper is going to be due on April 1st. Again, you can check out the syllabus to see upcoming labs and due dates. So this mini exam will just cover chapter 22, which we'll talk about today, the origin of species. So how do different species arise? What is a species? Here we have an example of the curved beak of the Hawaiian honeycreeper. So when we watched that video last week about birds evolving over time, one of them had a longer bill. Perhaps they were modeling it on this species. There are 5 objectives for this chapter. First, to understand the biological species concept. What is a species? What are reproductive isolation mechanisms? And why our definition of species is limited. There's some problems with it. Next, you should be able to explain the potential outcomes when 2 species are reproductively isolated, that are partially reproductively isolated, become sympatric. We've talked about that word sympatric before. Third, you should be able to compare and contrast the ways genetic drift and natural selection lead to speciation. Fourth, you should be able to compare allopatric and sympatric speciation. And fifth, understand the conditions that can lead to adaptive radiation. So first objective, let's talk about the definition of a species. So the general description is that species are members that are similar in appearance and are able to interbreed. So again, you can have species that are together in a single location, in a community. And then you also can have a species that is existing across many populations. So when we talk about species that are living together in an area or community, we call them sympatric, right? So when we talked about, for example, 2 different species of rock nuthatches and how they partition space or food type, we were talking about sympatric species. They're very similar to each other in appearance, and they use a lot of the same resources, and they're living together. Right? Now, we may not notice immediately that those two nuthatches are actually distinct species. However, they can tell each other apart quite easily. There's also an interesting effect. We can see where a single species may look really different, depending on where it is geographically. Here we have an example of a snake species that, depending on where you look in the US, it'll have a different appearance. So up northeast, it's going to look black, versus southeast, it's going to have a yellow appearance. And then there's some intermediate phenotypes like a yellow and black or a gray that are found in between. So even though these actually look different, they in fact are the same species. So the biological species concept is defined as a way to define species, and the idea is that they are reproductively isolated. So you can say two animals are a different species if they cannot breed successful offspring. Right? So species that can mate with each other, or individuals that can mate with each other, therefore must be the same species. So let's talk about more about speciation when you have reproductive isolation and sympatry. So these two videos below talk about this concept, and I encourage you to check them out on your own time as a way to study. Now, the ability to interbreed, right, in other words, is the ability to exchange genes. Right? Because when when a male and female mate, they each contribute genetic information to the offspring. So another way to describe, again, two individuals mating is exchanging genes. Now, there are different ways or reasons that two species may not be able to interbreed. We have pre-zygotic isolating mechanisms and post-zygotic isolating mechanisms. So pre-zygotic mechanisms are things that prevent those two species from ever making a zygote or a fertilized egg. And then post-zygotic mechanisms are things in which the egg may be fertilized, but it never reaches adulthood or is never a fully functioning adult. Let's talk more about these pre-zygotic isolating mechanisms. You can have ecological isolation, behavioral, temporal, mechanical isolation, or prevention of gamete fusion. So you can read in your book, there's examples of all of these different types. Behavioral isolation, for example, the mating behaviors of those two species are just too different, and so they don't recognize each other and won't mate. For example, we talked about stickleback mating in the past, how the female had to lift its head and then the male had to swim in a zigzagging pattern. It had to point at its nest, right? There's a very specific pattern of things that must happen. And so if a female stickleback approaches a male fish of another species and it doesn't do that zigzagging behavior, she's not going to be interested in mating with it, right? So that's an example of behavioral isolation. Another example, prevention of gamete fusion. So the animals mate, but then the egg is never fertilized. For some reason, the sperm never is able to fertilize the egg. Post-zygotic isolating mechanisms. Again, the egg is fertilized, but that zygote is never able to form into a fully functional adult with reproductive capability. Let's look at an example of ecological isolation. We have our Tyglion, or maybe you've heard of a liger. So this is when a male tiger and a female lion mate. So it is physically possible. The resulting offspring has the size and color of a lion, but will have striped fur patterns like a tiger. Now, this does not normally happen in the wild, right? So they live in completely different areas. They never meet, right? So even though technically you can make, say by in vitro fertilization or putting the two animals together in a zoo or something, you can create this offspring, this hybrid. In wild, they would never interact. They're ecologically isolated, and so they're considered two different species. Another example, here we have an example of behavioral isolation in blue-footed boobies. So this is a type of bird, and this genus, the blue-footed boobies, as you can see, have blue feet. And they mate with this elaborate courtship behavior where they lift their feet up, they show their feet to the female, they bring a gift over, they do a bow. You can watch their behavior in this video that I've linked below, right? So if a female blue-footed booby sees another species and it doesn't have blue feet, it doesn't do the dance where it lifts its feet up, she won't mate with that other species. So think back. What type of selection do you think is enforcing this bright blue color in the bird's feet? This is a type of sexual selection. Specifically, it is intersexual selection. Another example of behavioral isolation can be seen by differences in visual signals that are given during mating behavior, sounds, pheromones, or even electrical signals. We talked in the past about fireflies that have specific lighting patterns that when they light up that distinguishes the different species, right? That would be an example of a visual signal that's causing behavioral isolation. Another example are these lacewing bugs. They have this auditory signal, this sound that they make to attract mates. And the different species of lacewings have different calls. So you can see here, and we have a graphical representation of these different lacewing species have different types of calls. And the females can tell the difference between them and will only mate with the species that has the correct call. Temporal isolation is pretty interesting. This is another situation in which you could technically have these two species interbreed and produce hybrids, but again, in the wild, they never come into contact. One example is the species of wild lettuce. They are found out along roadsides in southeast US, and one of them is only found in the summer to be flowering, and the other only flowers in the spring, and so there's never a chance for pollen to spread from one plant species to the other. So they're temporally isolated. Another type is mechanical isolation. So the structure of the male and female copulatory organs are incompatible. It's just not going to happen, right? So bees and pollen is one example. Here we can see, just as a quick refresher, I know this isn't botany, but in order for a plant to be fertilized, pollen has to land onto that style, onto the stigma, sorry. And so what usually happens is a bee will come up and land on that anther and will collect pollen. It gets stuck onto that bee's body. It's sticky all over. Then that bee flies to another plant to pick up pollen from that other flower. And it may happen to brush against the stigma of that second flower, and pollen from the previous flower can fall off onto the stigma and fertilize that plant. Now, if the bees, for example, are shaped in a certain way that they never bump against the stigma, those two species of plants are never going to interbreed because the pollen will never fall off that bee onto the stigma. Another example we have talking about gamete fusion, so another prezygotic mechanism. So some species will shed their gametes into the water. So some fish species like zebrafish, the female lays the eggs and they sink down to the bottom of the stream or the river, and then the male comes by and releases sperm, and that is fertilizing the eggs externally of the mother. Now, there is obviously like a biochemical process that happens. And so if the eggs and the sperm are not able to attract or fuse to each other, the egg won't be fertilized. Um, in plants, the growth of pollen tubes may be inhibited in hybrids between different species. So on our previous slide, we had that stigma where the pollen would land, and then that pollen has to form a pollen tube down deeper into the flower. And if these are two different species, there may be problems biologically with that pollen being able to form the pollen tube. Let's talk about some post-zygotic mechanisms of isolation. Leopard frogs, we have these in our lab. They were originally thought to be one species, but in fact, there are multiple related species. What happens is they can mate, they can produce fertile embryos, but those embryos, those hybrids, don't develop, and they usually die before they even get to adulthood. And even in the lab, scientists cannot make these hybrids survive, right? Alternatively, these two species may be able to mate and produce hybrids that survive, but they may not be as fit, so they may not reproduce as well. For example, mules. This is a horse and a donkey that mate together. They have abnormal sex organs and they cannot reproduce. They're sterile. Let's look at this example of the leopard frog. So in this picture of North America, we've got 4 different species, closely related species of leopard frog, and they're found in different areas of North America. And there are regions where they do overlap. For example, species 1 and 2, that blue and the purple area, where that border is, the frogs will breed, they'll mate. However, their offspring do not survive. Now, as I said before, are some limitations to our definition of species, right? So is reproductive isolation, the ability to mate, really the only rule to determine species? No. So scientists have shown that characterized unique species, sometimes they do interbreed and produce hybrids, right? So for example, we have over 10,000 different bird species, but 10% of them in nature can hybridize. So some things that scientists use as well as reproductive isolation to determine species is appearance and also genetics, right? And so now that we can sequence genomes really quickly, that is being rapidly used as a tool to identify different species. Now, let's talk more about how these different species occur. We've talked about natural selection. This is the idea that an animal is going to adapt to its environment. Wherever it is, whatever traits it has that allow it to use its resources most effectively, to be able to reproduce frequently and with strong, good offspring, those are the traits that are going to be selected for, right? So over time, the variety is going to narrow down to the most optimized shape or appearance or behavior for a specific species in that specific environment. And that's called stabilizing selection. For example, maybe you live in a desert, and so to camouflage best from predators, it's good to be tan, right? Over time, any darker animals of that species are not going to be selected for because they're going to get eaten because they're obviously seen. And the tan feature is going to become more common, right? It's stabilizing that feature. So again, sometimes we do have other problems with this biological species concept. So just because two species in nature never meet doesn't mean that if you put them together, they will mate, or that if you perform IVF, in vitro fertilization, it will produce an actual successful hybrid. Also, there are some organisms that are asexual, right? So how do you distinguish species if you can't use reproductive isolation as a method? So how does one species become divided into two, right? So typically what we're going to use as our rule is if a species acquires some new trait or behavior that allows it or prevents it from mating with others of its original species, now it is officially different enough to be considered a new species. So this is a continuous process, right? And you can have a situation where two populations may only be partially reproductively isolated. So maybe they can mate, but they don't mate as often, right? So you can have this initially incomplete mechanism that gets reinforced over time until the species cannot mate at all, right? So maybe you have a population of birds and a subpopulation becomes a slightly different color, right? The female will mate with that bird male that's a slightly different color, but it's not its preference, right? But over time, because it's not mating with that different colored male, it's not exchanging genetic information, those two different birds, they're going to reproduce and their offspring over time are going to become more and more unique until eventually they're so different that they don't want to mate at all and they can't. That is reinforcement. Let's look at an example of that. This is kind of a difficult concept, and I encourage you to take some time to read in your book about this idea of incomplete isolation and reinforcement. Here we have two species of phlox. So these flowers normally are this light bluish purple color, and they can be found in Texas, one species in central Texas and the other in eastern Texas. Now, when they are coexisting, so when they are sympatric in the same area, one of the species is actually going to change color and be red, right? So butterflies can actually distinguish between the red and the light blue, and they say may only pollinate, may only travel to just the red flowers or just the blue flowers. What that means is that those butterflies that can carry pollen and promote genetic exchange between this blue and purple, this purple and red flower are likely not going to travel back and forth between these different colors. So those plants are not going to interbreed. Right? What happens then? Eventually, they will acquire more and more differences until they are they're two separate species that physically cannot interbreed. Let's talk about genetic drift in natural selection. So natural selection we've talked about, right? This is changes over time, adapting to one's environment so that you have the optimal traits to survive and to reproduce. Genetic drift is similar to this, but it is on a very, very small scale with a very small population. Right? Genetic drift typically happens due to random events. So things such as disease, maybe some type of disruption of the environment, right? And what you're seeing with genetic drift is a subpopulation, a very small number of individuals in that population get separated, right? So even though they're still the same species, they are reproductively isolated from that main group, right? So this can cause things like genetic drift, founder effects, and population bottlenecks. Now we'll talk more in future chapters about these different types of genetic drift, but I encourage you to check out this video below. It's a really great description of these different processes. Right? So the important thing about genetic drift is that it occurs when you have a small subpopulation getting separated, and then over time it's changing and becoming unique from its original home population. One example can be seen in Drosophila, so flies, across Hawaiian Islands. So perhaps they were originally all together and something caused them, this population of flies, to be separated among all the different islands. Each of the flies at those different islands now have a unique environment that they have to adapt to. And so over time, the flies on those different islands can become unique species. So again, what does it mean to become a unique species? That's when we're talking about reproductive isolation. Let's look at another example in lizards. So there can be lizards that adapt to living in different areas in a forest. Maybe some are going to be up higher in trees, maybe they're going to be on the grass, maybe they're going to be in a rocky area. And over time, they are going to develop slightly different physical characteristics. So you can see in this example, we've got some with a red dewlap, a yellow dewlap, right? And their body colors are also slightly different, right? So these dewlaps in these lizards are what they use to attract mates. If a female sees this bright color, it is like, hey, I see you. What's up? How's it going? Right? So if this lizard over time ends up, say, living in a grassy area, and it evolves to be green, and its dewlap, say, is green, the female can't see that male. Right? So even though it could physically mate with that lizard, because its dewlap and its body color are kind of camouflaging in with the background, she doesn't see it and she won't mate with that animal. Right? Let's talk about allopatric and sympatric speciation. So speciation is a two-part process. So first, the two identical populations must diverge. In other words, you'll have this population, one species, that's all living together, and something causes them to separate, right? So they are physically separated from each other. They're still the same species, right? Then, over time, they must evolve enough and in different ways so that eventually they're so unique they can't mate anymore and they have reproductive isolation. So again, it's important that they have to be separated so that they can't mate for a while, right? Because again, when we talk about mating, we're describing gene flow, exchange of genes, right? The more exchange of genes you have, the opportunities to mate, the more homogeneous or kind of even you're going to see, the more homogeneous your population is going to be, right? So speciation is going to be more likely when you have a population of one species that gets geographically split in two. So they're physically separated and they can't mate. And over time, they evolve differences so that even if they were brought back together again, they're physically incapable of mating. So what are some examples of ways that this geographic isolation could occur? So we could have remote islands, right? So birds may be able to fly to a remote island and they stay there, and over time they evolve different from the birds on the mainland. Rivers can come in and split a population in two, right? Here we have an example of a beetle population that's been split in two by a new river, and now those two populations, even though they originally were the same species, are going to evolve differently and may eventually not be able to reproduce if they ever came in contact. Another example, say some trees are lost, maybe due to forestry or due to a fire, right? And so in this picture, we've got some smaller trees, some medium-sized trees, and some large trees, right? And so different species are going to live on these different trees. Some are going to prefer being on smaller trees, others are going to prefer to be on larger trees. And also, you may have, just a second. All right, so sorry about that. I'm just going to start over with number C. I just got distracted for a minute. So you've got this forest, and you've got trees of a variety of sizes, and you've got a species that's spread out among all these different size trees, all right? And for some reason, say the intermediate sized trees get removed or destroyed. And so what happens is now you have some of these species that are on the small trees, some that are on the large trees. They are isolated from each other. So we've talked about sympatry, right? Two species that are living closely together in the same community. When we talk about allopatry, that means populations that are separated from each other geographically, right? We've talked about allopatry before, right? So one example of this can be seen in the little paradise kingfisher bird species on different islands. So here we have the island of New Guinea and this kingfisher species. Now, these kingfisher birds migrated to all these different little islands surrounding the mainland. And over time, because they were isolated, they diverged in their appearance, right? So you can see that on some islands they have shorter tails, they have different colors, right? Bill size is different. And so because these birds were geographically isolated on these different islands, they were not mating with each other, so there was no genetic exchange, and over time they became more and more unique. And eventually, if those two species were to come into contact, or two different populations were to come into contact, they would not be able to reproduce, and so they would be characterized as two different species. Meanwhile, if you look at the birds on the mainland, all right, they are able to get in contact with each other really often. There's genetic exchange occurring, and so they all look pretty much the same or homogeneous on that island. So let's talk about sympatric speciation again, right? We are saying, all right, geographic separation is really important for new species to arise, right? They have to be separated so that they can't mate, they can't have exchange of genes, and they must become more unique over time. However, that is not always needed, right? So there can be sympatric speciation. That is where you have a population that splits in two in a single location, right? And they eventually become reproductively isolated without ever having to be separated physically from each other. And we've actually talked about this before when we've talked about character displacement, right? So you've got a population, and a subpopulation adapts to use resources slightly differently, right? That is character displacement. And if those changes are significant enough in that species, that subpopulation, they can become reproductively isolated and considered a new species. So getting into this in a little bit more detail, this can be called disruptive selection, right? So over many generations, you can have something become more different, a trait become different between two species over time. So, for example, we have these two different types of, I don't know, squirrels or chipmunks, right? And the population is going to split, and there's going to be one subpopulation that has a shorter tail and one that has a longer tail. Having a shorter tail helps them to escape from predators, right? Because they can run quicker and there's less for them to grab onto. However, having a long tail is really good for balancing in trees, right? So you have this population, there's some variation in tail length. Maybe the shorter-tailed squirrels are living on the ground, and the longer-tailed squirrels are living up in the trees, right? Over time, selection for either a very short tail or a very long tail is going to occur, right? There's no benefit of having a medium length tail here. And so eventually these two subpopulations are going to appear quite different, right? We've had disruptive selection and they may eventually not be able to mate with each other. Let's talk next about adaptive radiation. So adaptive radiation, this is very similar to that idea of allopatric speciation that we talked about before, right? You have a population that was split into a variety of environments, and each subpopulation had to adapt to its own place, its own unique environment. So radiation, kind of spreading of that species, and then adaptive, they're having to adapt to their new environment, right? So I heard a really great statement that said the reason that Earth has so many species is because it has so many environments, right? The more variety of environments there are that a species has to adapt to, the more opportunity there is for natural selection to occur and for the origination of new species to happen. So again, this island example is often used to describe adaptive radiation. There's also something that can occur called a key innovation, right? So this is a trait that occurs that makes a big difference for that species. So it's not necessarily making that subpopulation unable to mate with the other species in its population, but it's so special that it's giving it almost like superpowers, right? So for example, this would be things like lungs in fish or wings in birds, right? The ability to breathe air opens up a whole new world to fish, right? Or for a rodent to develop wings. Now this rodent, can explore the tops of trees and travel further, right? And so this key innovation requires both speciation and adaptation to different habitats, right? If that fish is going to get lungs, it probably needs some other traits too to help it survive on land, like feet. Let's talk more about adaptive radiation. So this is commonly seen, as I said, on islands. We have on the far left of this top picture a mainland where a single population of birds migrates to a nearby island. Right? They colonize one island, and then eventually it spreads to different islands nearby. These birds then, they're in these new unique environments. Each of those islands, they're not identical, right? And so over time, they're going to adapt, they're going to evolve to become optimized for the different environments that they're in, and could result in now 3 different species. Now it doesn't stop there, right? So we've got these 3 different species. This occurred due to allopatry, right? They were geographically separated from each other. What can happen next is that these unique species can then visit other islands, right? And you can have a mixture. And you can also have where they then visit each other's islands, and now they have to compete. And so then you have even more evolution occurring to allow for things like resource partitioning. So again, character displacement. We've talked about this before. It's when you have two similar species that are acquiring different traits that allow them to partition a resource so that they can coexist, right? So maybe you have two species that have similar sized beaks and they're going after the same sized bug. Eventually, if one species acquires a trait where it has a slightly bigger beak and it can eat slightly bigger bugs, now it has a slightly greater fitness, an advantage. And that's going to be selected for, and that bird's beak, that species of bird's beak is going to get larger and larger over time. And that promotes even more divergence between those two species. Let's look at another example of adaptive radiation here in Hawaiian Drosophila, or flies. So on Hawaiian Islands, there are over 1,000 different types of flies. Who knew there could be so many types of flies, right? We've got an example of two different flies, two different species. You can see they vary a little bit in their appearance, right? And they also can have different behaviors as well. And so flies were that traveled to all these different islands, were radiated to these different islands, adapted to each unique environment that they encountered. And so we have some flies that are predators, others that are herbivores, detrivores, they're eating, carrion or dead animals and plants, nectar eaters, and parasites. So depending on their environment, some of them needed to become predators, others needed to become nectar eaters, right? And so as they evolved, eventually they became reproductively isolated and are now considered unique species. And of course, we have the ever popular Darwin's finches example of adaptive radiation, right? So there was an original ancestor finch species that reached a variety of islands. They had different environments that they had to adapt to, so different selective pressures, right? And so they initially had this geographic isolation, so they weren't intermingling, genes weren't being exchanged, and they became more and more diverse and eventually became reproductively isolated. Here we have a nice example of these different species. So we have a variety of species, some that are more adapted to feed on the ground or on cactus. We have some that are more adapted to be in trees. We also have some that are warbler finches. And when you look at them, you can see some similarities in the different types of finches depending upon where they are living and what required characteristics they must have. So there probably was some character displacement, right? So you have an island and you've got on that island a variety of different sub-environments, right? So first we had adaptive radiation, right? So they were geographically isolated on these separate islands. And then within each island, they were competing. And so they underwent character displacement. So in sympatry, they evolved so that they could use resources differently. So we have two different ways that we have speciation of Darwin's finches going on. So some of the finches adapted to feed on the ground, others in trees, right? Some of them eat insects. And so they now, if you look closely, they have physical or behavioral differences and are reproductively isolated. Another example of adaptive radiation can be seen in Lake Victoria with cichlid fishes. Okay? So Lake Victoria is this giant lake in East Africa, and until recently has a ton of different cichlid species, right? And about 200,000 years ago, There was the original ancestral population that was pretty similar, one population in this giant lake. Now, it's thought that the lake dried up a bit, and so the water levels dropped. And you can imagine that one big lake could be now split into multiple smaller lakes as the water evaporated. And now this one species has a bunch of subpopulations that have become geographically isolated. And so now they can undergo allopatric speciation, right? Within their own little lake, those cichlids are going to adapt to be optimized to that environment. And then it's thought that the lake waters went back up again, and now these species, even though they originally you have all these different populations that originally could intermingle and mate, but they've been away from each other for so long, they've acquired so many different traits that they now are reproductively isolated and are considered different species. So what are some types of examples of differences, different traits that they acquired? So how they found their food. So I love this. They have mud biters and algae scrapers and leaf chewers and snail crushers, right? So depending on what was available in their little lake, they adapted to be able to get the most resources. An example of a key innovation here was a second set of jaws that function. So some of these subpopulations acquired a key innovation that allowed them to get better access to food by having this second set of functioning jaws. And so I did say that there used to be a ton of species, right? Unfortunately, in the 50s, this predatory species, now perch, were introduced into the lake. And so over 70% of these original, what did I say, 300 different species are now extinct. This picture just shows kind of demonstration of these different traits that they acquired. So the algae scraper, I believe it is, has the second set of jaws that help it to scrape against rocks and things like that to access algae a little bit better. In addition to being physically separated and adapting to these different environments, now that they're all back together again, if there were any that were still competing for a resource, now they can undergo in sympatry character displacement, and you can have further speciation. So that's it for today's lecture. Again, make sure to read the book and check out the videos that I posted here. I will be posting pretty soon an update about lab reports, but go ahead and submit those online on Canvas today. You have by the end of the day. Feel free to email me any questions, and I'm happy to talk over the phone as well if you would like that. Right? Keep in touch and best of luck with the rest of your classes.